We are talking today with Kevin Phillips. He is the author of 11 books and in town to talk about his latest book, American Dynasty, Aristocracy, Fortune, and the Politics of Deceit in the House of Bush. Kevin, thank you for sharing time with us today.
My pleasure.
If you would start out and tell us why this book and why now?
Well, the basic premise of the book, as I started it, was the question of dynasties, and this dynasty in particular, because for the first time we had a oldest son of a president elected 8 years after his father left office. His name was almost identical. His mannerisms were similar. The people involved in funding the campaign were, many of them, the same. It was a continuity. It fit the term dynasty on the highest level. Previous dynasties have not been able to get a second president in a similar framework. We had, for example, we had an Adams, but the Adams came 24 years after his father had left office and in a different party, so there wasn't any continuity to speak of at all. With Roosevelt, we had Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, Franklin D. Roosevelt, a Democrat, and again, quarter century apart. So no parallel here. This is something entirely new. I thought the newness of it was worth pursuing. Now, as I did pursue it, what I found was that the nuance that kept coming up was that this dynasty goes back 4 generations. The founding fathers were George H. Walker, a St. Louis financier, and Sam Bush, who was an Ohio Steel Company president. And a lot of what they did that got them into the power structure nationally came about as a result of World War I and the early stages of American global importance as a source of military supplies, and then as a participant in World War I, and afterwards as the leading creditor nation in the world, and the balance of power of money swung to the United States. And in the next generation, you had Prescott Bush, who was a senator from Connecticut elected in 1952, but by the end of the decade, his wife is reporting that he thought if he'd gotten involved earlier, he could have been president. And by the early 60s, the current president, George W. Bush, at prep school at Andover, was already talking about how his father wanted to be president, although he hadn't been elected to anything yet. So they've been thinking about it a long time. The dynastic aspect is very important because they have shared interest groups, shared antecedents, shared commitments to finance, oil, defense, and then they've had a shared relationship in each generation. It's been there with elements of the national security state and the intelligence community. And that has been a very, very shaping thing, and that surprised me.
I'm wondering if we can go into a little more detail on the beginnings of this dynasty. You had mentioned George Walker and Sam Bush. Can you give us a little more detail on how they came into their power?
Well, George Walker was a St. Louis financier, and he rose to some significance during World War I when he was involved in both wartime finance and the beginnings of the industry in the United States providing munitions for Britain and France. There was a huge demand for American war material, and he was involved in that. A number of his friends were in powerful positions in Washington, and he made such good connections during the war that in 1919, Averell Harriman, who was heir to a major railroad fortune, he enlisted George H. Walker as his partner in a firm called W.A. Harriman and Company. And together they got very involved with investments in Germany and Russia. Now, investments in both countries were, I can't say easy to arrange, they were difficult to arrange in Russia, easy in Germany, but they bore the prospect of being extremely fruitful because both countries have been devastated by the war or by revolution, and they thought they could make a lot of money out of this. Now, in doing these investments, they became very closely involved with the State Department, the various government agencies, They were involved in a number of different corporate relationships, and some of them involved hiring people who'd been in the intelligence services. So they made some powerful connections. The other great-grandfather, because these two, George H. Walker and Sam Bush, are great-grandfathers of the current president. Sam Bush was the head of Buckeye Steel in Ohio. It was a company that was partly owned by the Rockefellers and Standard Oil. And the president of Buckeye who preceded Sam Bush was Frank Rockefeller, who was the youngest brother of John D. In 1917, Sam Bush went to Washington as the head of the Small Arms, Ammunition, and Ordnance section of the War Industries Board. In that role, he regulated in a very significant way giant companies like Remington Arms, that was the leading producer of rifles and pistols and ammunition for the war. After the war was over, he went back to Ohio, but the connections he had made resulted somehow or other in his son, Prescott Bush, meeting George H. Walker's daughter in St. Louis, where Prescott Bush, Sam Bush's son, was working for one of the major war contractors after the war. So you had a coming together of Prescott Bush and Dorothy Walker, and Prescott Bush then went where his father-in-law, George H. Walker, was, which was W.A. Harriman and Company. He went there in 1926, and then it became Brown Brothers Harriman. So Prescott Bush really came into the swing of things in New York largely because of his father-in-law, but partly also because of his father and his own Yale connections with people who were part of the post-war financial crowd in New York in very powerful positions. We have to jump ahead now to Prescott Bush, who was the grandfather of the current president, and by the end of the 1930s, he still has some connections with Germany and Russia from the businesses that were set up back in the 1920s by his father-in-law and W.A. Harriman. So one of these, and this is one that's gotten a lot of attention, but it's very much misrepresented. He was a director in the late 30s, Prescott Bush, of something called the Union Banking Corporation, which was set up in the 1920s by Harriman and Walker in connection with the German Thyssen steel family. They owned the biggest steel company, which became very important during the 1930s as a principal source of Hitler's war production. So in 1942, the alien property custodian in the United States in the Justice Department seizes the assets of the Union Banking Corporation because it was German connected. At this point, you have Prescott Bush as a director of this company. Now, this is the reason why some internet sites just go off on a tangent and link the Bushes and the Nazis. What really seems to have been involved here is that by the 1930s, as the United States faced a difficult situation with Germany, Prescott Bush and some of his colleagues on the board of the Union Banking Corporation, who came from the same firm as he did, started getting in touch with governmental authorities to see what to do about this. And they approached the New York State banking superintendent, for example, and he told them to stay put. So it's not as if they were by this point doing anything that the government authorities didn't know about, which again brings you back to this question of a close relationship with the intelligence community. One of Bush's partners at Brown Brothers Harriman, and again we're talking about Prescott Bush, the president's grandfather, one of his partners at Brown Brothers Harriman was Robert A. Lovett, who went on to become Secretary of Defense after World War II and was one of the people who drew up the blueprint for the CIA. So Prescott Bush was extremely close to people in authority in the State Department, the War Department, and the intelligence community.
Okay. And from there, his George Bush, how does he tie into all this? I know that he was former head of the CIA.
Well, George Bush Sr., obviously coming from the background he did, had family ties to an awful lot of important people. His father was in a position to help him enormously because he was friendly with the whole senior echelon of the War Department and the intelligence community. In 1942, George H.W. Bush is 18. He's getting out of prep school. He wants to go in the Navy. He wants to become a pilot. He wasn't old enough. He didn't have the college requisite years for this, so his father had to make an arrangement. We don't know exactly how he did it, but he was a personal friend of the Secretary of War. He was a personal friend of the Assistant Secretary of War for Aviation. He was a personal friend of Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Air, so he could have done it many, many ways. Those were all people he knew. The question is when George H.W. Bush, George Bush Sr., developed his own connections with the CIA, probably well before he became CIA director. Now, several people suggest it was when he was at Yale, because Yale was very close to the CIA. A lot of the people involved in setting it up had Yale connections. Again, I mentioned Lovett, his father's partner, before. Others suggest that it wasn't Yale, that it was when he was in the oil business some years later in a company called Zapata Offshore, drilling for oil off platforms in the Caribbean. And that at this time in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the CIA was very interested in surveillance in the Caribbean because they saw the problems developing with Fidel Castro in Cuba, and then they saw Castro taking over in Cuba, and the U.S. government basically wanted to chase him out of there. So the Bushes had a history of ties to Cuba, and some think that Bush's company, Zapata Offshore, had ties to the CIA or was even a conduit for CIA money and provided some services in connection with Cuba and the Bay of Pigs. Now, there have been things that have linked Bush to the CIA during the 1960s. There was a document that came out in November 1963. The FBI document said that they had briefed Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency on the attitudes in the Cuban community in Miami after the Kennedy assassination. Now, the CIA denied that it was the same George Bush, but it wasn't a terribly convincing denial, so people still wonder about that. The long and the short of it is Bush was probably, I underscore probably, connected to the CIA in some form or fashion before he became the CIA director. And then that, of course, jumps it to another level.
Yeah, I know a lot of people have questioned how he could have gotten that choice position based on his earlier experience. I mean, I think, as you pointed out, he's never really won an election prior to this. He had been appointed to many things, but never had really won very much.
It's not implausible for him to have been appointed. It's just that when you look at his background, you wonder if he didn't have these connections before, and whether that played a role, I have no idea.
If I could ask you quickly, the Union Banking Company, whatever became of that, and what became of the profits that were made through that?
Well, it's not clear that it really made profits. There's a real dearth of information on what this bank did. The probability is that it handled some money flowing from Germany to the United States, and then some money flowed back. There are no records. So what it might have done during the 20s and 30s is a matter of speculation. Obviously, some people think that it was laundering money, but if you can't prove who got it and where it came from, it's sort of hard to prove it was laundered. So the answer is nobody knows what it really did during the 20s and 30s and what it was set up for. And you can come up with some hypotheses, but there isn't any proof. So when the federal government seized the assets of the bank, basically what they did is they called in the stock. They canceled the stock and dissolved the bank, but not immediately. It was still around for 6 or 8 years, and there isn't precise evidence as to what happened to the money that was in it, but it looks like the government simply seized the stock and canceled it and repatriated some of the assets, but maybe seized others on a permanent basis. I'm not clear what happened.
Jumping back to George Bush Sr., his presidency obviously set up to a great degree our current president. There seems to be people connected from his presidency to the current, as you previously stated. Talk a bit about the transition there and how we got to our current president. He also had some experience in oil and some similar experience, but none of it very good.
Well, his youth was not spent in commercial success, let's put it that way. After his father had been CIA director, George W. set up an oil business in Texas called Arbusto, which is Spanish for shrub, which is interesting. The money that was raised for this venture came from some interesting people. One of them was a man named James Bath, who was later thought to be a CIA agent, but he was recognized at the time as the North American representative for the bin Laden family in Saudi Arabia and for the family of Khalid bin Mahfouz, who was one of the leading Saudi Arabian bankers. So Bath, apparently using the money from these people, invested $50,000 in George W.'s Arbusto business. Then, about a decade later, when his father was president, George W. had another weak oil company and he needed some help, and he sold out his oil company to something called Harkin Energy. And Harkin Energy was connected in a number of different ways to the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which was later identified as, well, even then identified as a rogue bank with intelligence connections. So the way in which George W. received some of this funding has raised questions, let's put it that way, and nobody precisely knows the answers here either.
Does it seem odd to you that this wealth of information, which you've compiled into one book, that the different pieces haven't had more examination by the mainstream press?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there are a lot of things that are in the public domain. You can get this information. You can get the corporate directorships, for example, out of the New York Directory of Directors. It's not hard to do, going back to the 20s. A lot of the rest of it has been discussed piecemeal in places. What I find surprising is that there hasn't been much attempt to link it all together. Now, especially surprising is the extent to which there hasn't been an attempt to link together all the circumstances of the father's administration and his 4 years and the scandals that he was involved in at the time, because of the element of continuity between the two administrations and the extent to which George Bush Sr. kept getting involved with the Middle East. And as a result of his involvement with the Middle East, a lot of things happened. There's a lengthy set of things that he was involved with, ranging from the so-called October surprise in 1980, which is controverted, Iran-Contra, the scandal providing arms to Iran. Then George Bush Sr. was involved in Iraq-gate, a scandal that New York Times columnist Bill Safire was very prominent in revealing. And Iraq-gate was building up Saddam Hussein before the Gulf War. So all of this strikes me as enormously relevant to the presidency of his son, where he too gets involved in the Middle East. He too gets involved with Iraq. And you sort of wonder how all of this evolved. You also wonder how his Saudi connections either helped him to understand where to investigate before 9/11 or in fact handicapped him in being willing to investigate all these people who were commercially familiar to his family.
Yeah, because it seems that any one of these scandals from George Bush Sr.'s administration, the October surprise, Iran-Contra, Iraq-gate, those alone should have raised enough red flags that the corporate media would have picked up on that. But
Well, they didn't. There was some mention of some of these things a little bit, but there was a decision, if in fact anybody even really made a decision, to treat the second Bush as a separate entity, as somebody not flowing from his father's presidency. I think that was fundamentally mistaken. I think you had a dynasty emerging here. You had a son who was elected with his father's name, his father's connections, money from his father's friends, obviously with a set of loyalty to a lot of his father's friends and embroilment with places his father was embroiled. I think it was just a central mistake not to link these two presidencies. And for the media to have said, well, what his father did doesn't matter in analyzing his son's presidency. Again, I repeat, I don't think anybody sat down and said, this is our view, that it's not related. But I think the effect was the same, that they didn't go back and look at what that first presidency, in a sense, forecast for the second.
What about the support and or the continuity from Bush Sr. to Bush Jr. from the Republican Party's viewpoint? It seems that the current Bush administration is far more radical in a lot of its directions than the previous administration.
Well, I think that's true. As far as what George Bush would have done from 1988 to 1992, if at that point he'd had a Republican Congress, we can't know the answer because he didn't. I think it's absolutely correct to say that George W. is the most radical and right-leaning Republican president certainly since the 1920s, and it's such a change of territory that I don't think you can even analogize it back there. George W. has been radicalized on economic issues, radicalized in terms of the support he has from and gives to the religious right, and perhaps most of all, he's been radicalized on the Middle East and on Islam and on the threat that we face by 9/11. And he has said in a number of places that God was talking to him before he ran for president. He said in a number of places that he believes that he was chosen. I mean, he's reported at least to have said this by people who say that he said it, that he was chosen, that he's to lead America through this crisis, and et cetera. So it's an extraordinary thing. He's a metamorphosis of the Bushes' much more right-wing economics, much more unilateralist foreign policy, much more truck with a religious right, and a sense that God is talking to him. It's an extremely unusual combination.
Well, in that vein, that God is talking to him, he seems to have something in common with perhaps some strains of royalty from old Europe. Weren't many of those presented to the regular populace as being somewhat appointed by God?
Yes, the divine right of kings was an aspect. Now, I haven't heard any attempt in Washington to relate to that tradition. It probably wouldn't work too well. But you can go back and even Queen Elizabeth in the UK is still described, her title, the old one, Defender of the Faith. So that's the Church of England. The King of Spain was His Most Catholic Majesty. The King of France was His Most Christian Majesty. Be interesting if we had to come up with His Most Fundamentalist Majesty or something for George W. I don't know what you'd use. I mean, obviously, nobody's having a contest to do that, but you're quite right that if you go back and look at the monarchs in Europe, they all claim very strong ties with God and the chosenness of the royal house.
What is your take on some of the people that are currently key players in the current Bush administration, specifically Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld? My understanding was Donald Rumsfeld hadn't been a big supporter of Bush Sr. And I find it kind of interesting that then he is pulled in as a key player in the current administration.
He hadn't been a big supporter of Bush Sr. He actually had been a rival of Bush Sr. back in the 1970s. But Rumsfeld got involved during the 1990s in a lot of study groups and commissions and developed a reputation as a hardliner in foreign policy and a supporter of the missile defense system and actually a supporter of a very hard line in the Middle East. So although he hadn't been a supporter, he actually was quoted in one of Bob Woodward's books as having said back in the 70s that he thought George Bush Sr. was a lightweight, which is an interesting nuance.
And how about Dick Cheney? He also came from working somewhat in parallel with George Bush Sr.
Well, Cheney had been Secretary of Defense during the first Bush administration. So he'd been a major player in the Gulf War. He'd been a Deputy Chief of Staff in the White House, actually under Rumsfeld, who was the Chief of Staff, in 1975 when Saigon fell and the final crumbling of Vietnam took place. So these guys go way back, and they go back to a pattern of wars in the Republican Party that haven't been terribly auspicious. They go back to Vietnam, that didn't work out well. They go back to the first Gulf War, which wound up being handled inadequately, and people thought that by the end that Bush hadn't been that successful, and now we have what's going on in Iraq. You've got these guys who've been involved in all three. That's over 30 years. And I don't know how the circumstance in Iraq is going to play itself out. But clearly the United States has problems there, and having misjudged it enormously back in May when the president in his flight suit lands on the carrier and does his war dance about how it's mostly over. They didn't understand that the worst was still to come. And maybe the worst is going to lead to civil war. Maybe it's not. It may work out decently, but there's also a chance it's going to work out pretty poorly. And if that's the case, then you have to look at Cheney and Rumsfeld and say, you know, this team has been operating before, and it doesn't have the world's greatest success story.
Tell me about your perceptions of the current Republican Party. You had previously worked for an administration, I believe the Nixon administration. Do you get the sense that the Republican Party is happy and supportive of Bush George W.? Because of the Republicans that I do talk to, almost every single one of them says that they had supported him on the last election, and they wouldn't support him this time around.
That's an important enigma. My feeling is that something like 85% of the Republicans support him. It may even be higher than that. Because a lot of people who used to be Republicans or Republican-leaning independents may not consider themselves that anymore, and that affects the way they'd answer a poll. But in parts of the country, New England, New York, the Great Lakes, Oregon, Washington, Northern California, you've got somewhere between 10 and 20% of the Republicans are disaffected. It's not to say they'll all vote against him, but it's conceivable that 12 to 15% of the Republicans in parts of Washington and Oregon and Northern California and New England are off the reservation. That doesn't mean that anything remotely like that is true nationally, but in certain parts of the country, that may well be the case. I'm not sure that's too great a threat to him, because basically they lost those states the last time out. You can almost win with the South and West together if you throw in a few more northern states like New Hampshire and Indiana. It's enough.
Where do you see your book fitting in with the next election? Are you hoping for a little more press scrutiny of the Bush dynasty?
I'm hoping for it, and I think it'll happen. Now, the question is how much. There's a very major technical inhibition here. Most of these things happened quite a while ago. Most of them happened without a legal proceeding in which testimony was taken or grand juries held hearings or people were subpoenaed. So the record was not finalized at the time. 15, 20 years ago, in the case of some of these things, more than that. There's no way now, with statutes of limitations and people dead and no legal proceedings, that you can establish some of this evidence as legally conclusive evidence. What you have is a lot of circumstantial evidence that tends to support the case that some of these things probably happened much the way that the family would like them not to have happened. Is all this ever going to be put together in a legally convincing package? I suspect not. Is it going to be put together in a circumstantial evidence package that suggests to the average American that a lot of this stuff must have happened? Well, that is sort of up to the media. I think a lot of this stuff must have happened. I say that as a lawyer. But that doesn't mean it's legally provable, because you don't have all the legal procedures that are necessary to establish something conclusively. So I hope the media do this. I can understand the reticence, but when you have such continuities between the administrations and you have a son who's continuing his father's war and so forth in the same part of the world, I think it's in order for the investigations to go forward of what is probably not conclusively provable back in the late 70s and 80s. I think there's a public policy reason for trying to know what happened there, even if you can no longer produce a legally concrete circumstance.
You have been the author of 11 books. How has the audiences, when you do your book tours, how have they been receptive to this current book? Have you seen an increase in interest in your writing in this particular book?
There's a definite increase. I've gotten some extraordinary attendance at things, and people have come in much greater than anticipated numbers. There's definitely a sense among conservatives and loyalist Republicans, like, this is awful, this is whatever, and so forth. And I guess my position on this is an offshoot of what I just said about it. I think it's important to discuss all these things. But it's also true that on some of these scandals, significant roles were played by Republicans in raising these criticisms of George Bush Sr. The prosecutor, special prosecutor in Iran-Contra, was a Republican deputy attorney general under Eisenhower. Lawrence Walsh. And then Bill Sapphire, who was a Republican White House aide under Nixon, criticized George Bush Sr. so much for Iraqgate that he wrote a column saying that he wouldn't support him. Now, we can't conclusively prove what happened in a legal sense, but there's certainly a lot of reason to think that a lot of Republicans were blunt enough at the time in discussing it, too, that hopefully the body of circumstantial evidence can be built up much more for history. And hopefully it will be.
All right. Any final words you'd like to share with our listeners?
Not really. My sense is this really is an important set of issues, and if these things can all be buried because they're 25 years old or 20 years old and they're no longer susceptible of a legal action or proof, that isn't enough reason to bury them.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for spending time with us today.
My pleasure.
We've just been talking with Kevin Phillips. He is author of American Dynasty, Aristocracy, Fortune, and the Politics of Deceit in the House of Bush.